So, in my introductory episode, I promised you that this channel was not going to be overproduced, that it would not be heavily scripted and heavily edited. And I have lived true to my word because in episode 2, Introduction to Postmodernism, I realized I made an error, the same error not once but twice. So let's correct the record on that error, and while we're at it, let's use that as a launching point for a discussion of recursiveness in postmodern fiction. So I said something that I wasn't expecting because it wasn't scripted. I said it 2 times. What I said was, it's crocodiles all the way down. Now that's incorrect. That's an incorrect quote of the old story. What I should have said was, it's turtles all the way down, which is a correct quote of the old story. And the reason I started thinking about this was I was thinking after the fact, maybe people didn't know what I meant by that. So let's start by talking about the old story. And I haven't researched this directly, but it's commonly understood to be that once upon a time there was an ancient Hindu belief, before people had a model of modern cosmology, that the earth was a flat disk that sat on the backs of 4 very large elephants. And those elephants in turn stood on the back of a very large turtle. Now, what was that turtle standing on? Another turtle. And what was that turtle standing on? Another turtle. What was that turtle standing on? Another turtle. And so how the anecdote goes is, somewhere along the line, someone says to someone else, student says to some philosopher, "What's that turtle standing on?" And the philosopher, not wanting to go through this, says, "Oh, it's turtles all the way down." That's a funny story, of course, because turtles all the way down, there's no bottom. And this can be used to talk about, concepts like infinity. And certainly it is. And a concept like infinity, I think, is very interesting to the postmodernists. But this gets to one of the common structures that we see in postmodernism among that breed of postmodern writer who is interested in structure, which many of them are, not all of them are, many of us are, I am, not all of us are. You'll see one of the structures that's fundamentally interesting is this idea of recursiveness, an Ouroboros swallowing its own tail, right? And we can think about, let's use a couple examples that we all know. Think about the Quaker Oats box, right? I love the Quaker Oats box. There's a box of Quaker Oats, and what's on the box of Quaker Oats? That round cylinder, right? What's on it is this Quaker. And what's he holding in his hands? A box of Quaker Oats. And what's on that? A Quaker. And what's he holding in his hands? A box of Quaker Oats, etc. Now this is wonderful. This is wonderfully postmodernist. It's wonderfully self-aware, and it's just well ahead of its time, right? Just as a little aside, I always thought there was a missed opportunity if those of us from the days of classic commercial television, if you remember the Kool-Aid commercials where the Kool-Aid man would smash through the wall when people needed something to drink in yellow. Yeah. And this Kool-Aid man was a large anthropomorphic pitcher of Kool-Aid with arms and legs. And what was he holding in his hand? A pitcher of Kool-Aid. And I always thought that pitcher of Kool-Aid needed to have a little face and arms and legs and could be holding a pitcher of Kool-Aid, etc. Right? And in that way, it's fractal. It's like a Mandelbrot set. We love us a good Mandelbrot set, don't we, as postmodernists, because it's the same thing. It's bottomless, and it repeats, and it's got this marvelously rich and endless structure that you can do things with, you can play games with, and you can work with. And so this is one of the things that postmodernists really enjoy, right? And this takes a variety of forms, and I'm not going to try to cover them all here because we're going to get into this in the future. This thing, fundamentally, it's very metafictional, it's very meta. It invites comparisons to metafiction, metafilm, metadrama automatically. It's also, like I said, very structural. You can easily connect it to concepts like labyrinths, which is another thing that we see a lot of. Imagine, simple things that are easy to portray and use. Facing mirrors. if there's ever a character standing with two sets of facing mirrors and they're disappearing infinitely in either direction, that's a reference, an allusion to this kind of recursiveness that is fundamentally interesting in postmodernism. And I think there's such a great example of this. It is metafictional. It's also recursive. It's equivalent. It's very similar to the Quaker Oats box or the Mandelbrot set. And I want to read it to you. It's Julio Cortázar's Continuity of Parks. Now let's take 1 second and let's talk about spoilers, because when I was thinking about this episode, I had to think about spoilers. And ultimately, I've decided, in general, we're not crazy about spoilers, right? You don't want to have your enjoyment of a literary work ruined. And if I'm looking at a booktuber about something I haven't read yet, I'm always worried that my enjoyment of that thing is going to be read. So let's just cover this right now. I don't know how to get into the specifics of authors and literary works without including spoilers. I don't know how to do it. By its nature, if we're talking about Gravity's Rainbow and the ending of Gravity's Rainbow and why it's called Gravity's Rainbow, we have to spoil the ending. There's no way around it. And likewise, I want to be able to get into detail. I'm going to have episodes where I talk about just a work or an author or a technique. And by that nature, without having spoilers, I can't have that conversation. And even if I have kind of a general highfalutin conceptual episode, like the one before this one, like this one, fundamentally, I want to share specific details with you. If I share specific details, I make it better. It gets better. And sharing specific details by its nature involves spoilers. So I'm just going to say right now, I'm going to try not to horribly and wantonly and cavalierly ruin stuff for you. But at the same time, I'm just going to have spoilers. So let's be clarified. Now, in this case, it's easy because Continuity of Parks is not a terribly long short story. It's not long at all. It's sitting on one page on my screen here. And I'm just going to read the whole thing out loud. So if you've read Continuity of Parks by Julio Cortázar before, which I'm pretty sure is in his Blow Up collection, not 100% on that, but I think that's where it is, then, sit back and enjoy it again. It's a fabulous story. If you haven't read Continuity of Parks, I'm jealous of you. You're in luck. Sit and enjoy a fabulous story. So either way, let's just read Continuity of Parks, and then afterwards we're going to talk about it a little bit. So, Continuity of Parks by Julio Cortázar. This, of course, was written in Spanish, so this is the English translation that I got. He had begun to read the novel a few days before. He had put it aside because of some urgent business, opened it again on his way back to the estate by train. He allowed himself a slowly growing interest in the plot, in the drawing of characters. That afternoon, after writing a letter to his agent and discussing with the manager of his estate a matter of joint ownership, he returned to the book in the tranquility of his study, which looked out upon the park with its oaks. Sprawled in his favorite armchair with his back to the door, which would otherwise have bothered him as an irritating possibility for intrusions, he let his left hand caress once and again the green velvet upholstery and set to reading the final chapters. Without effort, his memory retained the names and images of the protagonists. The illusion took hold of him almost at once. He tasted the almost perverse pleasure of disengaging himself line by line from all that surrounded him, and feeling at the same time that his head was relaxing comfortably against the green velvet of the armchair with its high back, that the cigarettes were still within reach of his hand, that beyond the great windows the afternoon air danced under the oak trees in the park. Word by word, immersed in the sordid dilemma of the hero and heroine, letting himself go toward where the images came together and took on color and movement, he was witness to the final encounter in the mountain cabin. The woman arrived first, apprehensive. Now the lover came in, his face cut by the backlash of a branch. Admirably, she stanched the blood with her kisses, but he rebuffed her caresses. He had not come to repeat the ceremonies of secret passion, protected by a world of dry leaves and furtive paths through the forest. The dagger warmed itself against his chest, and underneath pounded liberty, ready to spring. A lustful, yearning dialogue raced down the pages like a rivulet of snakes, and one felt it had all been decided from eternity. Even those caresses which writhed about the lover's body as though wishing to keep him here, to dissuade him from it, sketched abominably the figure of that other body it was necessary to destroy. Nothing had been forgotten. Alibis, unforeseen hazards, possible mistakes. From this hour on, each instant had its use minutely assigned. Cold-blooded, double re-examination of the details was barely interrupted for a hand to caress a cheek. It was beginning to get dark. Without looking at each other now, rigidly fixed upon the task which awaited them, they separated at the cabin door. She was to follow the trail that led north. On the path leading in the opposite direction, he turned for a moment to watch her running with her hair let loose. He ran in turn, crouching among the trees and hedges until he could distinguish in the yellowish fog of dusk the avenue of trees leading up to the house. The dogs were not supposed to bark, and they did not bark. The estate manager would not be there at this hour, and he was not. He went up the 3 porch steps and entered. Through the blood galloping in his ears came the woman's words, first a blue parlor, then a gallery, then a carpeted stairway. At the top, 2 doors, one in the first bedroom. No one in the first bedroom, no one in the second. The door of the salon, and then the knife in his hand, the light from the great windows, the high back of an armchair covered in green velvet, the head of the man in the chair reading a novel. So, this is metafiction, right? The character from the novel has come to kill the person who is reading the novel. And Cortázar puts lots of clues in here so we can figure that out. The oak trees that are outside the door, the window of the man reading the book, and also where the people are navigating through the book. He mentions the velvet high-back chair multiple times. He talks about the velvet high-back chair being turned away from the doorway. He even talks about the estate manager in the beginning. The guy wrote a letter to the estate manager, and of course it comes back and says the estate manager. Joint property ownership, right? So this is metafiction, but also it's a loop. It's a recursive loop. It's an Ouroboros, right? Where the person, the fictional character, murders the person who is reading the book that he is in, and presumably, were he to pick up the book and read that passage, he would read himself murdering the owner of the book and himself picking up and reading that passage of the book and him reading himself that passage of the book, and etc. Right? So it's turtles all the way down. And this sort of structure, this sort of game is the kind of thing you'll see in postmodernist writing in general. And it's also probably worth touching, since we're early in this channel. A lot of these things, theme-wise, structurally, trope-wise, they're not necessarily exclusive to postmodernism. They're not necessarily new even with postmodernism. But oftentimes you'll see that the precedent examples are few and underdeveloped and maybe jokes or maybe accidental. And the postmodernists take this and really run with it. And they develop it more thoroughly, they explore it, They try to find all the ways to use it. You see much more of it, and you see it more rigorously and thoroughly developed, and just much more scope behind these kinds of tropes and structures and ideas. So metafiction doesn't start with postmodernism, but it blossoms in postmodernism. Concretism doesn't start with postmodernism, but it blossoms in postmodernism, right? Encyclopedic novels don't start with postmodernism, but they're given a real new life and a different life and a greater life as part of postmodernism. Ditto for minimalism, the opposite of this, right? So all of these ideas can be around, and I think it's interesting and worthwhile to talk about, previous examples that are previous to postmodernism, but you see a lot of these ideas really developed by the postmodernists, and that's where it comes back to these being kind of hallmarks, indicators of postmodernism. And so recursiveness, this is the big one. We're going to see recursiveness a lot. We're going to talk about it a lot. It's good to identify it here and talk about these forms it takes and many other takes. And as I'm talking about various authors and things, we'll come back to this. I'll say, look at the recursiveness. And then related things, right? Again, a lot of metafiction, labyrinths, things along these lines that are connected to this same basic idea, mirrors. And we'll see a lot of these things as well. And as we go on, I'll call out attention to these and we'll bring it out. So nice, crisp, short episode today. It's turtles all the way down, not crocodiles all the way down. I have proven that, yes, indeed, I'm not going back and editing these things like a conversation between friends. And just as friends could get that wrong, I got it wrong here. So my apologies for that, but it was a good launching point for a conversation, and I look forward to seeing you next time.